Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Betty Broderick. Let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Elizabeth Ann Betty Bashali was born on November 7th, 1947. She was born to Marita and Frank and was the third of 16 kids. She grew up in East Chester, New York, and was raised in a very hardworking family. However, her parents taught her that her role in life was to become a good wife and mother. Betty did go on to attend and graduate from the College of Mount St. Vincent, a small Catholic women's college in Riverdale, New York. In 1965, Betty met a man named Dan Broderick at a party after a football game between the University of South Carolina and the University of Notre Dame. Dan, he was an undergraduate at the time at Notre Dame. The way he introduced himself to Betty was a little bit strange. He wrote on a napkin, Daniel T. Broderick III, MDA. When Betty asked him, "What does MDA mean?" He said, quote, "medical doctor, almost," end quote. Well, they hit it off and they started to date. Dan then went to attend the Cornell University Medical School, and there the couple became engaged. April 12th, 1969, Betty and Dan got married at the Immaculate Conception Church in Eastchester. It was a lavish wedding ceremony planned by Betty's mother. The couple had their honeymoon on a Caribbean cruise and later stayed with friends in St. Thomas. When the couple returned from their honeymoon, Betty was pregnant with the couple's first child. Betty worked through her pregnancy until the day she gave birth to a daughter named Kim. After Kim was born, that didn't slow Betty down. She continued to work several jobs while devoting herself to motherhood, which she stated has always been her only ambition. Dan, he completed his medical degree, but he realized he didn't want to proceed with the medical training. Instead, he wanted to obtain a law degree. The couple, they had some very tough years. They really struggled. For a time, they lived between several apartments and for a time survived on food stamp assistance. Betty and Dan would go on to have 4 more kids, a daughter, Lee, 2 sons named Daniel and Rhett, and an unnamed boy who sadly passed away 2 days after being born. 1973, Dan graduated from Harvard Law School, and the family moved to the La Jolla area of San Diego. Dan's initial salary at the law firm where he got his first job was very low paying. Eventually, Betty urged Dan to go into practice for himself, so he did. Virtually overnight, Dan won his first $1 million case, and after that, the Brodericks became millionaires. Dan would now become a successful medical malpractice attorney. The Brodericks' personal life, however, was completely deteriorating. Betty complained that Dan was an absent father and husband. He spent way too much time working and socializing with fellow attorneys. Betty felt like a single parent to 4 small kids. In the early 1980s, Dan hired Linda Kalkina as his assistant. They began a secret affair that lasted the next 3 years. Betty, she was having suspicions that Dan was having an affair. However, Dan, he always denied it. However, one time, Betty waited all day and night at Dan's law office to celebrate his 38th birthday, only to find out Dan was with Linda. Betty was pissed and drove home in a rage and burned all of his expensive custom-tailored suits. Their marriage continued to deteriorate, so Dan finally moved out of the couple's home, bought a house of his own, and to Betty's surprise, took custody of the 4 kids. But Dan didn't stop there. He admitted that he was having that 3-year affair, got a restraining order against Betty, and filed for divorce. Betty was devastated. The divorce proceedings ended up turning into a long and hostile process. Betty felt she was being treated unfairly. Broderick versus Broderick became one of the ugliest divorces in the United States. Betty became obsessed with her anger towards Dan. She would repeatedly leave obscene messages on his answering machine, and she would also bash Dan and Linda in recorded telephone conversations with their children. It didn't stop there, though. One well-known incident involved Betty driving her vehicle through the front door of Dan's new house after he sold the family house from underneath Betty and without her consent. Betty also smeared a Boston cream pie all over Dan's clothing when she entered his new home one day completely unannounced, spray painted his walls, and broke his windows. Dan repeatedly had Betty brought to court on orders to show cause when Betty would violate the restraining orders that Dan would get against her. After one hearing, Betty was actually imprisoned for 3 days. 1989, after 4 long years, the Broderick divorce was finalized. The divorce trial was completely sealed off from the public at Dan's request. The courtroom doors were covered up with paper. At the end of the 8-day trial, Judge William Howitt accepted all of Dan's proposed numbers and ruled that Betty owed Dan $750,000 in Epstein's in cash advances, all accrued between the time Dan moved out and the date of the divorce was final on January 30th, 1989. Also, Dan was ordered to pay his wife, Betty, less than $30,000 in cash. In addition, and most importantly, Dan was re-awarded custody of the children. Betty then purchased a Smith & Wesson revolver. She claimed she needed it for protection because she was now living alone as a single woman. She took shooting lessons and by some accounts carried the gun with her most of the time she left the house. And she was making threats to shoot Dan. April 22nd, 1989, Dan and Linda were married. November 5th, 1989, 5:30 a.m. Betty had shot and killed Dan and Linda while they slept. The shots, all 5 bullets, came from her gun. 2 bullets hit Linda in the head and chest, killing her instantly. 1 bullet hit Dan in the chest as he was reaching for the phone. 1 hit the wall, and 1 hit a nightstand. Dan was 44 years old and Linda was 28 years old. But how did Betty get into the house in the first place? Betty was able to gain entry because she stole their house key from the purse of their daughter, Kim. After the shooting, Betty turned herself into the police. However, she never denied that she had pulled the trigger 5 times. So it seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, Betty would now stand trial for the murders of Dan and Linda Broderick. At her trial, Betty denied that she had any intention of murdering Dan and Linda when she broke into their home. When asked why she brought the handgun into the home that night, she replied, quote, "Because I wanted him to listen to me," end quote. And if he wouldn't, then she was going to commit suicide and, quote, "splash brains all over his goddamn house," end quote. She stated she shot Dan in the heat of passion as soon as she entered the bedroom after Linda started screaming, quote, "Call the police," end quote. But the defense's main angle was that Betty was suffering from battered women's syndrome, claiming she was driven over the edge by years of psychological, emotional, and mental abuse at the hands of her husband, Dan Broderick. The defense portrayed Betty as a woman who sacrificed her entire life to her husband and their 4 children. Betty held down 5 jobs in the early years of their marriage in order to help her husband get through medical school and then get through law school. Without Betty's assistance, Dan would never have become the successful attorney that he became. Dan then traded Betty for a younger model by cheating on her for 3 years with Linda. Then he divorced Betty, gained sole custody of the 4 kids, and then married Linda. Betty then snapped after all of this and committed the murders without premeditation. The prosecution, they portrayed Betty as a cold-hearted, selfish, narcissistic murderer who planned to kill Dan. They played countless phone messages that Betty had left Dan on their answering machine. Remember, she repeatedly bashed Dan and Linda. She also repeatedly vandalized Dan's home. They even had Kim, the couple's oldest daughter, testify how angry Betty was and how she showed no remorse after the murders. The prosecution argued to the jury, Betty was out of control, dangerous, and callous. In a magazine, the prosecutor said, quote, I've had my fill of Elizabeth Broderick. She was not a battered woman. She was getting $16,000 a month in alimony. She had a multi-million-dollar La Jolla house, a car, a boyfriend. I see abused women every day with broken bones and smashed faces. Give me a break, end quote. Betty's trial ended in a hung jury. 2 of the jurors held out for manslaughter, citing lack of intent. One of the jurors was quoted saying, I only wonder what took her so long, end quote. A mistrial was then declared by the judge. Betty would now have to stand a trial again for the murders. Her account of the murders at this second trial was, quote, the movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed to call the police. And I said no, and I just fired the gun, and the big noise went off. And then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it was just an explosion. I moved. They moved. The gun went off. And it was like, and it was fast, end quote. She claims she was unaware at the moment in the dark bedroom that any of the bullets had actually hit Dan or Linda. December 10th, 1991, the jury returned a verdict of 2 counts of second-degree murder. Betty Broderick was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus 2 years for illegal use of a firearm, the maximum that was allowed under the law. Betty Broderick is serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. In January 2010, her first request for parole was denied by the Board of Parole Hearings because she still did not show remorse. She did not acknowledge any wrongdoing. At the parole hearing, 2 of her children asked the board to release their mother, while the other 2 children asked the board to keep their mother in jail. Betty had a second parole hearing in 2017. She was again denied parole. Betty Broderick will next be eligible for parole in 2032. That is the case of Betty Broderick. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have any questions or comments on the case? Leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.